All right, hello everybody. Today we are going to be talking about Kull. I just finished reading this book of Kull stories. I think it's most of what we have of Kull stories, as well as a little bit of extra. I guess I don't know for sure, but this is what was in the book. So, this is an interesting character because this is one of those characters who it turns out actually was kind of an inspiration from a previous character. Kull was apparently kind of inspired by by a character called Ra, who was in turn inspired by the writings of a guy named Paul L. Anderson, who is now largely forgotten. Not Paul P-O-U-L Anderson, but P-A-U-L-L, middle name, Anderson. Who I don't believe I've ever heard of, but there's details of the history in the book that help to kind of fill things out a little bit. But the thing about Kull is that he kind of inspired Conan later on, right? And everybody knows who Conan the Barbarian or Conan the Cimmerian is, but at the same time, like, Kull is a very different kind of creature, or at least the Kull stories are a very different kind of creature. So, let's get into it. So, Kull stories did not sell well while Howard was alive. In fact, it seems like Kull was almost like an embryonic idea of Conan that Howard kind of wrote some things of, and then as he was writing, the character of Conan kind of popped out of that. There's more, maybe not more, but there's a lot of fragments and untitled drafts and unfinished works of Kull, as opposed to Conan, where the stories were often, complete. The ones that we have are there's a lot of completed Conan stories, and a lot of the ones that are in here that are even complete didn't actually sell. Kull stories did not sell very well, and I think I kind of understand why after reading them, because while I haven't read a lot of Conan yet, what I can see as a difference between Kull and Conan is that Conan stories are actually, they have a lot more of the conventional adventure story to them than Kull stories do. Kull stories are weird. Conan stories are concrete. They're definite. Kull stories are often very abstract, and it could almost be read as like fables. They're so short that there's very little character development, and generally speaking, there's some kind of lesson tucked in there that's not not particularly subtle. Kull himself is not particularly subtle. The connection from story to story is very vague. Time is vague. When this story happens compared to when this story happens is kind of vague. In fact, there are several of these stories that maybe several. There are several of these stories that Kull is just mentioned, right? There's at least one where the whole story takes place in like a second, kind of thing. It's a lot. It's a lot more experimental, I guess, would be another way to put it. Is that these Kull stories are not the kind of thing that you expected when you opened up your Adventure Story Weekly or something like that. I haven't talked that much about Robert E. Howard stuff in this on this channel before, but I've read the Solomon Kane stories. I have a book of those that maybe I'll go through again at some point and do a review, kind of like this. I've read a couple of Conan stories. I have one of the nice Conan, what do you call it? Comic books behind me. Howard's writing style is kind of, I guess you would call it deliberately antiquated, right? He's kind of pulling up, antiquated figures of speech, or what he imagines might be viewed as antiquated figures of speech. He's highly descriptive of things, while he's often kind of vague about actions. There's a very kind of a like in the style of an old epic, right? Old epic poems had this characteristic where there was a lot of repetition in them because they were actually an oral tradition, right? And so, there would be places where, and so the blah 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 blah, and things would get kind of vague, but it would be in a place where the speaker could repeat something that he kind of has memorized very well in order to move on to the next part of the story. And there's an element of that in the Kull stories if not so much of the poetic as, very flowery prose, I guess you would call it. There's a lot of berserker rage where, Kull gets into a fight. There's a lot of kind of, and he, his sword became a blur of yada, 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 where it's not really descriptive in a detailed way, but it's descriptive in kind of a vague, it's kind of weird to say, but right? It's like descriptive, but in a vague way, where there was a thing that was happening, but we don't see the details of the thing itself. We just know that this guy was defending Kull while Kull is swinging his battle axe at the top of these stairs at these bad guys, kind of thing. There's a couple of things that are repeated. In the action scenes, Kull almost always gets, a stab in the leg, a cut on the cheek, and, a cut on the non-sword hand shoulder, right? And so, there's almost, the cut on the cheek thing kind of reminded me of like the very kind of like a manga or anime cliche thing where the guy, dodges just enough that he gets the little blood thing on his cheek. And, that happens probably 4 times in this book in like 10 stories. There was a lot of, like, Conan was swashbuckling swords and sorcery, right? But this book has a lot of mysticism without really a systematic feel to it. There's no hint of the tabletop mage casting fireball in these stories, or very, very little, right? And by now we've kind of come to expect that. This book is even more vague about what magic does and can do. And I think that's deliberate, because the idea is to build mystique and mystery and to kind of, make things weird and interesting as opposed to make some kind of hard magic system, which people seem to love today. Kull is not one of those characters where he's constantly questioning himself. He's not one of those characters who's always kind of on the underdog side of things. He's always strong enough to overcome what needs to be overcome. Often just barely, but he always makes it through, and there's not really a whole lot of question as to whether he's going to make it through. There's near constant combat in these stories, and Kull is constantly wounded in his berserker fury in, kind of vague ways, or just somewhat vague ways. Again, stab in the thigh, cut in the shoulder, cut on the cheek kind of thing. These are mostly very short stories, and they're not written in like a serialized way like the Solomon Kane stories, where this story happens, and then this story happens, and then this story happens, and there's kind of an obvious through line. And they're not even the kind of thing where like in a Conan story where he may harken back to something that happened previously. All of these stories are pretty close to self-contained. Not totally, of course, but they're surprisingly self-contained stories. They're very short, so as I said before, there's not that much space for development. But honestly, that doesn't seem to be the point. The point seems to be more of a kind of a testing the waters, right? Like, it feels like Robert E. Howard was testing the waters with Kull. He was trying to figure out if he could make this kind of story, this kind of character, and see if somebody else wanted to read it. And the sad fact is that until much later, after he was already dead, nobody really did, right? Again, I think only 3 of the Kull stories were published, and one of them was published only when Robert E. Howard repurposed it into a Conan story by adding some subplots and making it longer and stuff. So, like, this is a weird character with weird stories, and part of that makes it actually very interesting. Again, the prose is very good. It's kind of Robert E. Howard's usual kind of, antiquated, descriptive prose. There is some poetry in this book, but not a whole lot. Not as much as there was in. I read something else recently that had a lot of poetry, but I can't recall what it was. But anyway, this book contains, for goodness sakes, Exile of Atlantis in its untitled story form for whatever reason, The Shadow Kingdom, The Mirrors of Tuzun Thun, An Untitled Draft, The Cat and the Skull, The Screaming Skull of Silence, The Striking of the Gong, The Altar and the Scorpion, The Curse of the Golden Skull, The Black City, which is an unfinished fragment, another untitled fragment, By This Axe I Rule, that's the one that got turned into a Conan story. Swords of the Purple Kingdom, The King in the Oak, which is a poem, and Kings of the Night, which is technically not a Kull story, but it's a story where he shows up. And then there's a good chunk of miscellanea and appendices that kind of give you a little bit more background, but, anyway. So, I don't know. This was an interesting read. It wasn't quite as gripping, I guess, as the Conan stories that I've read have been. It's not quite as, I don't know. It doesn't quite pull you in the same way, though it does still pull you in. It's just that it pulls you in more of an abstract way of I wonder what is actually being said here, as opposed to I want to see what happens next in this adventure, right? So very different from Conan in that sense, and I can kind of see why the Conan stories were better sellers than the Kull stories, because, as I said earlier, the Kull stories are a lot more abstract, almost fable-like sometimes. So, let's get into the spoiler section, and I'll do that, and then we'll have some conclusions, and we'll get out of here. All right, so here we go. All right, spoiler section. So I'm just going to kind of go through the main stories in this book, including the drafts and the fragments, and just give a couple of sentences about each, kind of talking about what they're about and what I thought of them. So, first off, Exile of Atlantis. This is a short... even the long stories are pretty short, but this one is... 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pages, where half of each page is taken up by a drawing. By the way, I'll mention this in the conclusion, but these were the illustrations in this book are by a guy named Justin Sweet, who I don't know who that is, but he does some really good kind of very nice ink drawings of stuff, which really helped with kind of building the mood, I guess. So, The Exile of Atlantis is the first real Kull story, I guess. Basically, it's Kull... It sets the stage for what Kull's character is like. He's ambitious, but very skeptical. So this story takes place, I think... It's very vague about where it's happening, but my impression of this story is that it takes place before Kull left Atlanta, or Atlantis. Sorry. Right? And this is him still with some Atlanteans. And what happens in this story, simply stated, is that he basically expresses great deals of skepticism about a lot of these, fundamental myths of Atlantis. Not the myths that we know about, but, the myths of Atlantis that the people of Atlantis believed, right? This is all fictional fun stuff like that. And in this story, he basically sees a vision of himself as the future king of Valusia, and then there's a woman who's about to be burned at the stake due to some transgression that she did according to Atlantean law, and instead of letting them burn her at the stake, he kills her, basically a mercy kill, and then he runs off, and that's kind of the end of the story. I think what this story kind of sets the stage for are these three characteristics of Kull. He's skeptical, so when someone tells him this magician said blah 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 blah, he's like, well, I don't know about that. He's ambitious, yeah, of course. He wants to be king of one of the great empires, and he wants to maintain that kingship. He doesn't go off wandering like Conan does in the sense of he gives up his kingship and wanders off. Kull wanders, but when he wanders, it's for official state reasons, basically. And he's also very independent, so he doesn't he doesn't follow anyone, and he kind of goes his own way regardless of what other people think around him. And these are pretty nice, simple... Oh, of course, he's a very powerful warrior. That's not so much in this story, but we'll see that later on. So, I actually did a review earlier of the Shadow Kingdom. That's also in this book. Of course, I'll just kind of go through it real quick. Right, Kull befriends this Khanu, who's this Pictish ambassador. Khanu introduces him to Brule, who becomes kind of the second in command, Kull's right-hand man. He's called Brule the Spear Slayer. And this story is about the conspiracy of the Snake Men. There's, ideas of how under a king there will be evil conspiracies that seek not only to undermine his rule, but also to, replace him without anybody knowing, things like that. we have kind of a theme, if you want to use that word, about like the two-facedness of leaders, right? That what we're seeing here is that these people who look like people are actually snakes that have magically turned themselves to look like the people that they're supposed to be. And by doing so, the good guys get killed and tucked away, and the snake men manage to kind of rule for their own purposes, right? The purpose, another thing that this particular story does is that it establishes who Kull's friends are and who his advisors are while he is the king of Valusia. So, that's kind of what the Shadow Kingdom is. I did an earlier review of that story in more depth, so you can go take a look at that if you want. The next story in this book is called The Mirrors of Tuzun Thun, and this story kind of establishes, again, and more strongly, Kull's kind of like what would you call it even? Like an antagonism towards wizards. Wizards are usually the enemies in these stories because the wizards are always crafty and making illusions and deceptions and yada yada yada. Basically, Kull learns that there's this wizard named Tuzun Thun who has this house or castle that's filled with mirrors, and this story is about Kull going there and saying, "Hey, can I look in your mirrors for a while?" And just kind of, and the wizard's like, "Sure, go ahead," right? And Kull just kind of spends a bunch of time staring at the mirrors and seeing the different things that he sees in the mirrors. He sees other worlds in the mirrors. He feels as if he's being pulled into other worlds that are in the mirrors. And, kind of the goal of this story seems to be kind of suggesting that the world that Kull lives in is separate, but at the same time as one with the rest of the universe and time and space and all the other fantasy worlds that might exist. It also kind of suggests the idea of like having the ability to get lost in one's own past or future, and also the danger of unguided magic. Kind of Tuzun Thun kind of leaves Kull to do his own things, and Kull almost gets sucked into a mirror, but thankfully Brule saves him at the very end. It's very abrupt, and then the story ends. Next up, we have an untitled draft. This is a story which is interesting because it establishes the shape of the world or the map of the world and then kills it. Basically, there's a guy who... How do I describe this? There's a guy that Kull decides he needs to chase. This guy does something, I forget what exactly, but he basically Kull says, "I need to chase this guy and catch him," right? And so he ends up basically chasing this man to the ends of the earth. He goes off to the east, galloping with 300 of his red slayers and Brule, and they go through a bunch of different countries. They cross some rivers. They meet with the king of a neighboring kingdom, that kind of stuff. And what this story does, which is interesting, of course, is it kind of builds a map of what the world around Valusia looked like in the time of Kull. And, that's all well and good, but it turns out that at the end of the story, that the guy that they're chasing basically went across the ancient equivalent of the river Styx before there was a river Styx. And at the very end of the story, Kull and his Red Slayers and Brule cross the river that no one ever has come back across the other way into the worlds of magic that no living people can fathom, kind of thing. And it's quite literally Kull goes around the area of Valusia, maps out a bunch of it, and then dies effectively without actually dying, kind of a Valhalla kind of situation, right? And this is an interesting story because it has this very dreamlike ending. It kind of builds on this idea of this kind of like hazy border between life and death, where all these times and places are connected, and so it doesn't really mean anything to die in the here and now when you might reappear in the vast future or something. And then we have the fact that basically we've ended the character of Kull. And then, Robert E. Howard's like, "Oh, I can't do that. For one, it means that he's not going to be in Valusia anymore. and 2, it basically means that he's dead, and now things get really weird, right? So, he stops the draft and he goes on to a different story, and this one, didn't ever, this one was never sold, or as far as I can tell, even attempted to be sold to any magazine, right? So, because it kind of starts and ends Kull at the same time, in the same story, which is a little bit ridiculous. The next story is called The Cat and the Skull. This is one of the longer stories. This is about... So it establishes the idea that there are these ancient beings other than humans on Earth who are very long-lived, and they have kind of lots of wisdom and stuff like that. We get something very silly on some level, which is a talking cat. And there's actually a really cool point in this story where the cat is basically a prophet or a seer or an oracle, and Kull basically gets into an argument with the cat, and is like, well, why can't you tell me, if everything that I'm going to do is already known, then what's the point in telling me anything? And the cat's like, well, there's multiple ways that you could go, and it's not really determined, yada yada. There's this very weird line that they're kind of fence that they're sitting on, where it's like, oh, are we determined or not? But then there's a very cool little passage about like the limits of the power of prophecy. I figured it might be fun to just read it right here. So the cat's talking, quote, "Because there are bounds set upon the powers of such as I," the cat replied, "lest we hinder the workings of the alchemy of the gods. We may not brush the veil entirely aside for human eyes, lest the gods take our power from us, and lest we do harm to man. For though there are many roads at each crossroads, still a man must take one of those, and sometimes one is no better than another. So hope flickers her lamp along one road, and man follows, though that road may be the foulest of all. You see, good king, that our powers must have limits, else we might grow too powerful and threaten the gods. So a mystic spell is laid upon us, and while we may open the books of the past, we may but grant flying glances of the future through the mist that veils it." So this is kind of a fun and fiction-friendly development, right? In the sense that, like, oh yeah, the prophets can't tell you everything. If they did, they would lose their powers. And you could write a story about that happening to someone, too. That would be really interesting, right? But, yeah, I mean, this is just kind of establishing a cool rule, which I thought was fun. Then the cat tells him that Brule was fighting with these creatures in the Forbidden Lake. Kull goes to the Forbidden Lake, fights a bunch of random stuff, finds the King of the Forbidden Lake. The King of the Forbidden Lake is like, I don't know this Brule guy. No one's been here for hundreds of years. And it all turns out that it was all a ruse. And then it even goes so far as to be like, oh, and the cat wasn't really talking either. It was just a ventriloquist. And also the ventriloquist is Thulsa Doom. And it's like, wait, the necromancer, your great enemy. It's like, first off, he's never been mentioned before. Second off, he's never mentioned again. And third off, all he does is basically rip the veil off his face, show that he has a skull there, say, gets stabbed by Brule, doesn't get hurt by the stabbing, says, "Nyaha," and runs off. So, whatever. It's a fun story, and it's a good story. I don't know. Robert E. Howard, in the appendices, there's discussion of like how Howard thought that this was a really bad story. But like, I don't know. I don't think it's poorly written. I just think that it is true that the plot is a little bit unsatisfying, and the bad guy hops out of nowhere. But again, this is kind of how Kull stories go, because Kull didn't take off in the way that Howard wanted him to. A lot of these stories are just like, ooh, what if I wrote this down? What if I wrote this down? And it's just like ideas thrown out, and there's very much of a kind of a brainstorming kind of feel to a lot of these stories. So next up, we have The Screaming Skull of Silence. Now, this is where things get kind of abstract, even more abstract, because basically there's this old wise man who's telling Kull these stories, and these stories talk about how Kull's powers are limited, or how like powers of humans are limited, and that the people in the past had great powers that we don't have any chance to replicate today. And Kull gets pissed off. He's like, I'm the biggest, greatest king ever, blah, 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 blah. And so Kull goes off to this castle where supposedly, like you might call it like the Platonic ideal of silence is held, right? It's like some kind of an entity that is the thing that silence is when silence becomes so concrete and powerful as to be a thing. It's, it's the usual kind of vague magical mumbo jumbo, but it works, right? Oh, this is what silence is when silence becomes so silent that it's tangible, kind of thing. But it's great because basically Kull opens the door, and it's like opening Pandora's box. Silence, the silence creature being thing is like, I'm going to now cover the whole world in silence, and all the soldiers that came along with Kull are all holding their heads in pain because the silence is too much for them, kind of thing. And there's basically this weird, like, magical jade hammer and gong hanging on the door. And, like, the door has, like, please don't open this. I trapped silence in here. Please don't open this door. But if you do open this door, here's a hammer and gong. Use them wisely. And by basically hitting the gong with this hammer, it's made of, like, this weird kind of, like, mystical jade material. It's, like, described as, like, green like jade, but it kind of also has this shimmery, wavery, kind of quality to the way that it looks. But basically, this is these two things. If you hit them against each other, they make all the sound, and that pushes silence back until Kull basically beats silence into submission and closes the door again. It's basically Pandora's box, but with a conclusion. If like the guy who opened Pandora's box grabbed all the things that came out of it and stuffed them back in and closed it up, it's like that. And so like it's a twist on an actual fable too, right? Like, Pandora's box story is a fable, and Kull's story here is the what would you call it? Like the inversion of that tale. So next we have the striking of the gong, which is strange. After we just got done with a story with a hammer and gong, we now have the striking of the gong. And this is the story that takes place in like 1 second, right? In the moment that a gong strikes the hour, Kull is attacked. He doesn't even see his attacker, but he basically gets hit in the head, and he kind of has this vision, an out-of-body experience, where he learns from this entity that kind of everything is connected, nothing is finite. There's a lot of mysticism and layers of universes upon universes. Is your universe within the spider web that is across the plants on the lawn of this particular universe? Or is that universe merely a speck in your universe? And it's all kind of, very vague and mumbo jumbo-y. But there is some fun stuff here, right? Where here's Kull, he's like, am I dead? And the guy's like, no, you're not dead. Kull's like, am I dead? There's this great conversation where like there's this like, embodiment of all otherworldly wisdom, and Kull keeps asking it, like Kull keeps like saying something to it, and it's like, no, I said you're not dead. Hold on, I'm telling you something. And Kull's like, but I'm dead. And it's like, no, you're not dead. Listen to me. But I have my body. Yeah, you're not dead. Right? It's actually like if you could easily make like a comic version of this story, and it would work perfectly, right? But here's the thing. Here's a quote that I thought was fun. Your barbarian brain clutches at material actualities, answered the other tranquilly. What does it matter where you are or whether you are dead as you call it? You are part of that great ocean of which is life, which washes upon all shores, and you are as much a part of it in one place as in another, and as sure to eventually flow back to the source of it, which gave birth to all life. As for that, you are bound to life for all eternity as surely as a tree, a rock, a bird, or a world is bound. You call leaving your tiny planet, quitting your crude physical form, death. Kull responds, but I still have my body. And then the voice responds, I have not said that you are dead, as you name it. As for that, you may still be upon your little planet. Yada, yada, yada. It's like, it has a lot of, it's like trying to be mystical, but at the same time it becomes kind of funny, because Kull is such a straightforward barbaric character, that she's just like, so I'm dead. And it's like, no, you're not dead. And it's a great little story. Next up, we have the first story where Kull doesn't actually appear in the story. Their story is called The Altar and the Scorpion, and it's like page and a half, 2 pages, something like that. Basically, there's these two people that are going to be killed, sacrificed by this one giant guy to some dark god, right? And they're praying to other gods. And one of the gods is like one of the gods that they're praying to is like a scorpion god that is supposedly like a defunct god. It has no worshippers. And, the basic idea is that they're supposed to be killed and sacrificed, but the remaining power of this old friendly god saves them. this is quite literally a fable, right? That even though this good god doesn't have any worshippers, if these people believe in him enough, he might come and save them just in the nick of time, kind of thing. Very, very, parable kind of story thing there, where like all of a sudden a scorpion, walks across this woman and climbs onto the hand of the giant and stings him and he dies, and then Kull arrives. And then right as the story closes, Kull is about to arrive to rescue them, and he would have been too late if not for this scorpion kind of thing. Let's see, the next story is called The Curse of the Golden Skull. And this one is about... How let me see here. They do. There's so many of them that they kind of run together a little bit, especially with the rather, like, what would you call it? Generic titles, and also the fact that a lot of the stories kind of overlap on each other in kind of thematic and even setting kind of ways. So, in The Curse of the Golden Skull, there's a man who kind of laments and curses Kull after losing to him in battle. And then we get a time jump, and millennia pass, and there's a modern man, like an archaeologist, who walks in, and he finds the temple where this man was dying who cursed Kull, and he finds his remains, and this story appears to just basically be a connection between Kull's time and world and our modern day. It kind of suggests that Kull's world is in this world only way, 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 way long ago. Next we have an unfinished fragment called The Black City, where this is actually a story that could have been really cool, like a really cool, straightforward adventure story. It even has kind of like some mystery elements that I think are kind of good. So, basically, Brule walks into the... Kull is sitting on a throne or something. It's a little weird because it supposedly happens in Kull's castle, and it's kind of like an extension of the secret passages we had in the Shadow Kingdom story, right? Brule walks in, he rips all of his medals and stuff off of his chest and throws them to the ground, and Kull's like, oh, this is bad. Brule is mad, and I don't even know why. And Brule's like, I just lost one of my men, and I'm not sure why it happened. And Kull's like, well, let's go see what happened. And they go, and it's like, yeah, I left this one guy. Basically what happened is we were all standing around, and then like the wall turned, and a guy came out and grabbed the guy that I was talking to and took him away. And I told the other guy that I was with, because there were three of us, to watch the crack and keep it held open a little bit till I brought you. And Kull's like, well, why did you tear the medals off your chest? And Brule's like, oh, I was pissed. And it's like, okay. And then it turns out that the guy that was holding the thing open with his sword, by sticking his sword into the crevice to keep the spinning jenny, no, that's not what spinning jenny's for. I mean, Lazy Susan. It's like a Lazy Susan in his castle, right? And he's trying to hold that open, and it turns out that when they find him, he's actually dead with the look of horror on his face. And then the story cuts, and it's like, oh, that could have been fun, but Robert E. Howard quit with that story and just went on to something else. We have another untitled fragment, which is basically just a 2-page scene of Kull playing something along the lines of chess with Brule as others look on. Just kind of, it's kind of the kind of thing that you might fit into another story as like a bit of world building or something like that. Anyway. Next we have By This Axe I Rule, which was later imagined into a Conan story that was called The Phoenix on the Sword. In this book, or in this story, Kull is king, but he's bound by ancient Valusian law, kind of until he decides he isn't. There's this assassination plot, there's these star-crossed lovers, where one of the lovers is a noble and the other one is a slave, and the law says, and I mean like the old law, like the law that's chipped into stone tablets, says that no slave and no noble can marry, right? And Kull's like, we didn't worry about this kind of crap in Atlantis. Why are you guys so worried about it? And everybody's very superstitious about it. But like at the same time, they're like, but it is kind of the law, and you gotta deal with the law. And through a series of events, basically the noble basically helps Kull out during an assassination plot, and Kull decides, like, well, I'm not going to let the law, prevent me from doing what I think is right at this point. Like, and so he brings out the stone tablet and he shatters it with his axe, and he says, I'm the law. And it's the kind of story that Howard had to write another couple of subplots into in order to make it into a full Conan story, but it still is kind of a neat story, if a bit like cliche almost. Actually, there was an interesting thing about this story where Kull is a barbarian, right? And so you think of him as kind of this barbaric character who has no interest in any cultural stuff, so to speak, right? Like he's very you would imagine that he's very uncultured, but in fact, in this story, we get a very interesting little tidbit of development for Kull, which shows that he has actually a much more nuanced view of the situation. So one of the guys who is part of this assassination plot is a guy named Redondo, and this is what Brule, it's either, is it Brule? I think it's Brule. I think Brule says to Kull, because they're trying to figure out who's in on this assassination plot and how they should deal with it. And Brule says this: "Redondo is largely responsible," answered the Pict, Brule, drawing his sword belt up another notch. "He sings songs that make men mad. Hang him in his jester's garb to the highest tower in the city. Let him make rhymes for the vultures." To which Kull responds. Kull shook his lion head. "No, Brule, he is beyond my reach. A great poet is greater than any king. He hates me, yet I would have his friendship. His songs are mightier than my scepter, for time and again he has near torn the heart from my breast when he chose to sing for me. I will die and be forgotten. His songs will live forever." So, I mean, that's a really great little bit of development, that Kull actually has kind of the perspective that these songs that Redondo sings might very well outlive both Kull and Redondo. And of course, later in the story, they fight. He straightened to defend himself from the maddened rush of Redondo, who charged in wild and wide open, armed only with a dagger. Kull leaped back, axe high. "Redondo," his voice rang sharply, "back! I would not harm you." "Die, tyrant!" screamed the mad minstrel, hurling himself headlong on the king. Kull delayed the blow he was loath to deliver until it was too late. Only when he felt the bite of steel in his unprotected side did he strike in a frenzy of blind desperation. Redondo dropped with a shattered skull, and Kull reeled back against the wall, blood spurting through the fingers which gripped his wounded side. And so, Kull is so reverent toward this singer and poet that he even hesitates to kill him until he's already kind of been stabbed. So, it feels cliche at this point, but it wasn't probably so much when Howard was writing. So again, that's another reason why I think this particular story, Swords of the Purple Kingdom, is in. No, wait, this is still by this axe, isn't it? Yeah, this is still by this axe I rule, and I get it confused with Swords of the Purple Kingdom because that's the next story, and also it has a lot of similar elements. It's another assassination plot story. It's very similar to By This Axe I Rule, but it's a bit more complex of plot. Now we have the lovers are a Valusian noble woman and a foreign adventurer. And Kull is captured by this group that's plotting his assassination through deception. And basically what happens is that the adventurer who wanted to marry this Valusian noblewoman defends Kull as he fights. So Dalgar wove a web of steel about the king, bringing into play all the sword skill that was his. Again and again his flashing blade turned a point from Kull's heart. Again and again his mail-clad forearm intercepted a blow that else had killed. Twice he took on his own helmet slashes meant for the king's bare head. It is not easy to guard another man and yourself at the same time. Kull was bleeding from cuts on the face and breast, from a gash above the temple, a stab in the thigh, and a deep wound in the left shoulder. And so there's this kind of cool scene where Kull is at the top of this staircase fighting this group of people that are trying to kill him. And this guy, who Kull was like, I can't help you, I can't make this Valusian nobleman's father, betroth his daughter to you. And this foreign adventurer walks in, and he basically, at great risk of his own life, uses his sword skills to defend Kull while Kull is beating away these assassins, and that allows the father of the noblewoman to recognize the value of this foreign adventurer, and happily ever after kind of ending, except for the people who got their heads cracked open. And then the final story in this book is called Kings of the Night, which is not actually a Kull story. It is actually a Bran Macmorn story, where Bran Macmorn is a descendant of Brule who lives kind of in the times of our Roman Empire. And he has a problem. He's got a bunch of soldiers, and he's got a bunch of Roman soldiers that are going to come and annihilate his people. He needs this group of Vikings to defend this particular pass. It's a very Sparta kind of thing. 300 men, narrow pass, defend it to the death, right? And they're like, no, we don't obey you. We need you to give us a king who isn't a Celt, who isn't a Briton, and who isn't a Pict. And Bran Macmorn is like, oh God, I don't have any of those things. I'm a king, but I'm a Pict. The Celts are, they're their own thing. They don't have a king either. The Britons don't have a king right now either. That's kind of what we're fighting about. What am I going to do? And so Bran Macmorn is just like, what am I going to do about this? And Kull appears out of nowhere. He's like, oh yeah, the wizard, Gonar, put me to sleep last night, and he said that I might see a vision. And I guess I'm having this dream where I appear in the future and help my good friend Brule's descendant in a fight. And I'm a king, and I'm not a Pict, or a Celt, or a Briton, so the Vikings will listen to me. And so, yada, 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 Kull is the head of the group that does the Spartan thing, only up in on the British Isles, and Kull kind of vanishes at the very end as this great kind of, they call him like the greatest king of all time kind of thing, and it's a very neat little a little more than a cameo, a little less than a Kull story, right? So there we go. And then after that, there's a bunch of miscellany that talks about like the pre-Kull material that led up to Kull, and some explanatory writings by other people who talk about like what Howard was doing at this point in time, yada yada yada. So there we go. That is all of the spoiler section. Let's get on to the conclusion. All right. In conclusion, Kull, the character Kull, was kind of a stepping stone as Howard was creating kind of doing a good part of creating what we now call the sword and sorcery genre, right? Before, at least according to some of the material in this book, before this point, the swords and sorcery material had generally been, readaptations of, like existing myths, like Arthur and the Round Table kind of stuff, or it had been, historical in like a real historical sense, and so didn't have the sorcery part. You might have swords, but not so much on the sorcery. And so, goodness gracious, the character Am-Ra was inspired by this Paul L. Anderson guy who Robert Howard read and loved. And then this Am-Ra character, who, there's just like a couple of paragraphs of Am-Ra. And Am-Ra actually appears in the first story, Exile of Atlantis, as well, and is kind of like a side character in that short story as well. Am-Ra inspired Kull, and then Howard played around with Kull for a while, and he made these stories that are not conventional adventure stories. They're not conventional sword and sorcery stories. A lot of the time they are very vague. A lot of the time they are very mystical. A lot of the time they are so short and so kind of based on the theme of this thing that the story is about, that they're almost like fables rather than adventures, right? And, Howard wrote these down and they did not sell. But as he was writing Kull, there were a couple of times where he would write part of a Kull story, and then he would start writing like a Conan story, and he'd be like, well, these are two separate things. These are two separate characters. What am I doing here, right? And someone would say, oh, you should finish this story with Kull, and he's like, well, no, but I'm writing this Conan thing, and that's working differently too. And then by the time like the Conan stories started to get published, like Robert E. Howard was not even sure that he could still write a Kull story anymore. He said that, like, writing the Kull stories, like, I just sat down and they just came out of me. I don't know what it was. Like, I didn't plan them. I didn't think about them. I just wrote stuff down and there was a Kull story. And, like, I can't do it anymore. Like, whenever I try to start writing a Kull story, I write a Conan story. And, like, I don't know. Something funky happened here, and I'm not entirely sure what it was. I'm not entirely capable of the amount of introspection necessary to figure out where the hell Kull went from my creative thing. And so, like, it's a really interesting character because he's not really a complete character. He doesn't have a lot behind him. He just has a bunch of, relatively short stories, and they're not very, like, coherently connected to each other. It's very dreamlike in a way, where, like, Kull did this thing, and then another time, no idea how much it's related to this time, Kull did this other thing. And then here's a story where Kull doesn't even show up, but they mention him, kind of thing. It's very weird and interesting, and it's not like anything I've ever read in conventional fantasy, right? There's no standard, here's the hero's journey. It's just not there. It's weird. And so for that particular reason, I think Kull is very much worth reading, especially since there's not that much of it, right? Like, we're looking at a story that if I go up to the miscellany part, right? Where is it? Here we are. 243 pages in not small font. This is totally readable in like a day, and totally worth looking into, especially since it's so, like, weird and also important. That's my kind of feel. Like, these are these short stories with simple plots and lots of characters, but not without meaning. Like, you can write a short story that is just like the last thoughts of a man who was pushed down a flight of stairs, right? You can do that. But, like, that story doesn't have a whole lot of meaning. It's a good way to, like, write things down and describe things in an interesting way. But there's not really much there, right? And these stories at least have kind of a fable ending in a lot of cases, where, there's some kind of lesson to be learned, and not in the Sesame Street kind of, here's our lesson for today, but it's often a weird and anachronistic lesson compared to what we think of as lessons today, which also helps to make it more interesting. They're fun short reads with lots of crazy stuff happening, and it's often more, like, contemplative than I think Conan is a lot of the time. Like, there's a lot of, like, Kull just, like, sitting there and thinking about stuff, or someone who is wise sitting there and telling Kull about stuff, and Kull listening. It's weird because there's this frantic, gory, crazy, blood-red fury action, and then Kull is sitting in a chair listening to someone tell him about what prophets can and cannot do. There's stuff in here that you might think is worth sitting back and kind of pondering a little bit, right? These are called heroic tales of adventure, but, like, they don't have the clear objectives or even unclear objectives and kind of through lines that a lot of common adventure stories have. And so it's worth taking a look at. And then there's one other thing I wanted to mention that I forgot to mention in the non-spoiler section, is that this particular book, which I'll have a link in the description, is illustrated by a guy named Justin Sweet. And he has a bunch of these really nice, like, ink drawings that are really cool. And there's a lot of them. And then he even has, like, these full painting illustrations, a few of those as well, like this one right here. So, like, is that visible? Hopefully that's visible. Anyway, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was really interesting and weird and unlike anything I've ever read before. So what can I say? It's if you're looking for something that's like, I mean, it's not going to blow your mind, but, like, it's like, oh, this is weird. I've never read anything like this before. I've read things that have elements of this in it, and a lot of those things that you've read that have had elements of this in it got those elements from this, right? Kull inspired Conan. Conan inspired a lot of sword and sorcery after that. So, I don't know. This is a really interesting book, worth taking a look at. Some of these stories are in the public domain. Maybe I'll do a link to isn't there like a wiki source or something like that where all the Kull stuff that is public domain you can take a look at for that. I'll see if I can find a good link or something for that too. But that's all I've got for this week. So yeah, hope you enjoyed my unorganized thoughts about Kull, Exile of Atlantis, and more. And yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. And I'll see you next time with probably the second story from the Aliens Omnibus, which is called Nightmare Asylum. So look forward to that, if you want. Anyway, so have a good one, and I'll see you next time.